Chapter 1: The White Maw. The Mi-8 helicopter beat a heavy rhythm against the stark, white silence of the Arctic. Inside, Kale and Var stared through the thick, vibrating plexiglass. Below, a jagged congregation of rust and ice loomed out of the endless expanse of the pack ice, the graveyard, as the locals in Utqiagvik had grimly called it. A flotilla of decommissioned Soviet nuclear icebreakers, locked in the frozen sea for decades, their reactors supposedly inert. Supposedly. Var's gloved hand tightened on the strap of his carbine. His breath misted in the chilled air of the cabin despite the heater's strained efforts. Beside him, Dr. Lyra Sorrenti, her face framed by the fur-lined hood of her parka, scribbled furiously in a data slate, her expression one of intense, almost predatory focus. Her pale eyes, the color of winter sky, flickered between the instruments in her lap and the approaching steel behemoths. Magnificent desolation, wouldn't you agree, Mr. Var? Sorrenti's voice, crisp and precise, cut through the engine drone. She didn't look at him. Var grunted, a sound that conveyed neither agreement nor disagreement. It's a dump, a dangerous one. Across from them, Jonah Kim, the expedition's comms tech and youngest member, pressed their face closer to their own window, a wide-eyed grin splitting their youthful features. It's incredible, like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Think of the salvage. Think of the radiation spikes we registered on the approach, Kim, Var said, his tone flat. This isn't a tourist trip. Bennett Croft, the representative from the energy consortium that had inexplicably decided funding this preliminary assessment was a good idea, squirmed in his seat. He was a portly man, bundled in layers that made him look even rounder. The preliminary scans indicated acceptable ambient levels, VAR, within tolerance for short-term exposure. His voice was thin, reedy. Our primary objective is to assess the integrity of the Lenin's primary reactor casing. Proprietary technology, you understand. Var understood corporate greed well enough. The Lenin, the flagship of this dead fleet, was their main target. He glanced at the helicopter's pilot, a stoic Russian named Dmitri who'd flown these routes for 20 years and hadn't said more than 10 words since takeoff. Dmitri's expression was unreadable, but his knuckles were white on the controls as they descended towards a relatively flat expanse of ice near the largest of the icebreakers. The wind buffeted the helicopter as it settled, rotors whipping up a cloud of powdery snow. The clang of the landing skids on the hard-packed ice was a jarring punctuation mark. "Welcome to the Hotel California of the Arctic, folks," Dmitri's voice crackled over the intercom, surprisingly laced with dry humor. "You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave." Sorrenti was already unbuckling. A charming sentiment, pilot. Kim, deploy the atmospheric sensors. Var with me. Croft, you'll remain here until we establish a secure perimeter on the Arctica. It's the closest and seems the most structurally sound for a preliminary base. The Arctica was one of the larger vessels, listing slightly to port, its red hull streaked with decades of rust that bled down onto the ice like old wounds. Its superstructure was a skeletal silhouette against the gray, overcast sky. A gaping maw, where a section of its bow plating had torn away, offered a dark, uninviting entrance. Stepping onto the ice was like stepping onto another planet. The cold was a physical blow, seeping through layers of thermal gear, stealing breath. The silence, once the helicopter rotors wound down, was profound, broken only by the faint, mournful creak of stressed metal from the derelict ships and the crunch of their boots on the crystalline snow. Var scanned their surroundings. The icebreakers were clustered irregularly, some upright, some canted at crazy angles, their superstructures creating a jagged, artificial mountain range. The air tasted metallic, sharp. His personal Geiger counter, clipped to his vest, emitted a low, steady series of clicks, slightly elevated but not immediately alarming. "Perimeter check," Var said into his comm, his voice tight. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, carbine held ready. Sorrenti, surprisingly agile for a scientist, followed close behind, her own counter already active. Kim was wrestling with a tripod, setting up a sensor array near the helicopter, their movements quick despite the bulky clothing. Croft remained huddled inside the chopper, peering out nervously. The entrance to the Arctica was a dark hole, fringed with icicles that looked like teeth. A blast of frigid air, heavy with the smell of decay, rust, and something else. Something faintly sweet and chemical wafted out. "Readings are interesting," Sorrenti murmured, her device held high. "Higher than ambient, certainly. A distinct neutron signature, but heavily shielded. The old girl still has some life in her, it seems." Her voice held a disturbing note of excitement. Var didn't like it. He'd been in enough forgotten, dangerous places to recognize the taste of trouble. This place reeked of it. He swept his weapon-mounted light into the darkness. The beam illuminated a narrow, ice-slicked corridor, steel walls weeping condensation that had frozen into grotesque patterns. Debris littered the floor, rusted tools, scraps of unidentifiable material, a single, frozen boot. "Clear for now," Var said, stepping inside. The temperature dropped noticeably. The clicks of his Geiger counter increased fractionally. "Sorrenti, stay close. Kim, report." "Atmospheric sensors deployed, Var." Kim's voice came back, slightly breathless. "Broad-spectrum rads are fluctuating. Nothing critical yet, but it's like the background noise has a pulse." A pulse. Var didn't like the sound of that either. They moved slowly down the corridor, their lights cutting cones through the oppressive gloom. Doors, some sealed, some hanging open on rusted hinges, lined the passage. The silence within the ship was different from the silence outside, heavier, more confined, full of the ghosts of past activity. Every creak of the hull under the pressure of the ice, every drip of meltwater, sounded unnaturally loud. Sorrenti paused by a closed steel door, its surface blistered with rust. A faded Cyrillic inscription was barely visible. Ka-a-u-ta-a-m-ya-ka-a-n-e-ka-a-ve, mechanic's cabin. "I'm picking up concentrated readings from within some of these sealed compartments," she said, her breath plumbing. "Residual contamination, most likely, or preserved samples." Var pushed on a different door. It groaned open, revealing a small, ransacked cabin, a bunk with a shredded mattress, a rusted locker hanging ajar. On a small, bolted-down table, a metal mug lay on its side, a dark stain frozen within it. Something about the scene felt staged or perhaps just abruptly abandoned. He ran his light over the walls, scratches, deep gouges in the steel as if something had clawed at it. Animal, human. Anything? Sorrenti asked, peering over his shoulder. Just decay, Var said, though a prickle of unease traced its way up his spine. He backed out. Let's find the mess hall or a command deck, something defensible for a temporary base. They found what might have been an officer's mess further down. Tables were overturned, chairs scattered. A thick layer of frost coated everything. In the center of the room, however, was something that made Var stop. A human body. It was encased in ice, slumped against a bulkhead as if resting. The figure was wearing the tattered remains of a Soviet-era naval uniform. The face, where it was visible through the cloudy ice, was gaunt, eyes closed, skin a pale, waxy yellow, perfectly preserved, too perfectly. Sorrenti gasped a small, sharp sound. She moved forward, her scientific curiosity overriding any revulsion. Remarkable, the cold, the low oxygen. It's like a natural cryopreservation. She raised her scanner, and the radiation levels around him are significantly higher, almost as if he absorbed it. Var felt his own counter tick up noticeably as he approached. "Don't touch it, doctor." His voice was low, urgent. "Of course not," Sorrenti said, though her fingers twitched. "But this is an invaluable find. The effects of long-term, low-level radiation exposure in a cryo state, the cellular degradation patterns." A sudden, loud clang echoed from deeper within the ship, cutting her off. It sounded like heavy metal striking metal. Both Var and Sorrenti froze. Var's head snapped up, carbine raised. "Kim, you hear that?" A pause, then Kim's strained voice. Loud and clear, Var, sounded big, not from the chopper. Another clang, closer this time, followed by a scraping sound. Var exchanged a grim look with Sorrenti. The graveyard was not as dead as they'd been led to believe. The white maw of the Arctic had teeth, and they were just beginning to feel their bite. The air in the mess hall seemed to grow colder, the silence more menacing. The clicks of their Geiger counters seemed to be getting faster. Chapter 2: Whispers in the Steel. The scraping sound came again, a drawn-out metallic shriek that set Var's teeth on edge. It seemed to emanate from the deck below, or perhaps further along the corridor they had just traversed. He motioned Sorrenti back, his body language all sharp angles and readiness. "Stay here, keep your light on that body," Var instructed, his voice a low command. He didn't like leaving her, but he needed to investigate the noise. Leaving a potential threat unexplored in their intended base of operations was not an option. Sorrenti nodded, her earlier excitement replaced by a visible tension. Her gaze flickered between the frozen corpse and the dark passage Var was about to enter. "Be careful, Var. The acoustic anomalies in these structures can be deceptive." "Understood." He moved with swift silence, his boots barely whispering on the frost-slicked deck. The beam of his weapon light sliced through the oppressive darkness of the corridor. Each shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Each creak of the ancient vessel sounded like a footstep. His Geiger counter's insistent ticking was a constant, unnerving companion. He reached the junction where they had turned towards the mess hall. The scraping had stopped. Now only the groaning of the ship's hull under the immense pressure of the surrounding ice filled the silence. Var listened intently, straining his ears for any other unusual sound. Nothing. Could it have been ice shifting, or the decaying structure settling? Possible, but the distinct metallic clang before the scrape felt intentional. He swept his light down the unexplored section of the corridor. More closed doors, more debris. One door, heavier than the others, was slightly ajar, a dark slit in the gloom. It looked like it led to a machinery space or an engine accessway. The air wafting from it was even colder, carrying a stronger metallic tang and the faint, sickly sweet odor he'd noticed at the entrance. He approached cautiously, weapon raised. Pushing the heavy door further open with the barrel of his carbine, he peered inside. It was a narrow catwalk overlooking a dark chasm, likely an auxiliary engine room. Pipes, thick as a man's torso, crisscrossed the space, all coated in a thick layer of rime. His light beam didn't penetrate far into the depths. The clicks of his Geiger counter intensified sharply as he leaned into the doorway. "Anything, Var?" Sorrenti's voice, tight with anxiety, crackled in his ear. "Negative. Looks like an engine access. High radiation readings down there. Could have been machinery settling." He wasn't convinced, but there was nothing overtly threatening visible. He pulled back, letting the heavy door swing partially shut with a dull thud. Whatever made the noise, it wasn't immediately apparent. He returned to the mess hall. Sorrenti was still focused on the ice-encased body, her scanner hovering over it. "The isotopic signatures are fascinating," she murmured, almost to herself. "Significant concentrations of cesium-137, strontium-90, even some trace transuranics. It's as if he was a filter." "A dead filter," Var corrected, his gaze sweeping the room, checking every dark corner. "This place isn't secure enough for a base. We need to find the bridge or a primary control room. Better visibility, more defensible." "The Lenin is our primary objective, Var." Croft's voice whined over the comms from the helicopter. "Mr. Var, are you making progress toward the Lenin? The consortium is very keen on updates regarding the reactor." Var thumbed his comm. "Croft, we're establishing a temporary foothold on the Arctica. The Lenin is further out, and we're not trekking across open ice until we're sure this ship is clear. There are complications." "Complications? What sort of complications?" Croft's voice rose in pitch. "The report indicated these vessels were derelict, abandoned, unoccupied." "Reports can be wrong," Var said dryly. "Kim, how are those atmospheric readings? Still pulsing?" "Affirmative, Var," Kim replied. "It's weird, like a heartbeat, slow and irregular. And the broad spectrum is definitely trending upwards. Not critical, but a noticeable climb in the last hour." Sorrenti looked up from her examination of the frozen sailor. "A pulse. That correlates with some of the intermittent energy fluctuations I'm detecting from deeper within this vessel. Perhaps a decaying secondary power source, or a shielded component reaching a critical state." Her eyes gleamed. "We should try to pinpoint its origin." "We should try to stay alive, Doctor," Var countered. "Let's move. We'll check the upper decks." Reluctantly, Sorrenti pulled away from the corpse. They navigated through more darkened corridors, up a narrow, ice-encrusted stairwell. The metal groaned under their weight. The higher they climbed, the more exposed the ship was to the elements. Wind howled through shattered portholes, driving fine, stinging ice particles into their faces. Several sections of deck were warped or missing, revealing glimpses of the lower levels or the gray, turbulent sky. They found what looked like a communications room. Equipment lay smashed and scattered. Wires hung like dead vines. Someone or something had done a thorough job of wrecking it. Var noted more of the deep scratch marks on a steel console, as if something with powerful claws had tried to tear it apart. "No quick repairs here," Kim commented ruefully over the comms as Var described the scene. "Even if the antennas were intact, the internal systems are trashed." Sorrenti, meanwhile, was running her scanner over a section of bulkhead where a faint, barely perceptible humming could be felt. "The vibrations are stronger here, and there's a localized thermal variance. Something behind this wall is active." Var examined the bulkhead. It was thick steel with no obvious access panel. "Could be a conduit for the main reactor, even if it's decommissioned. Heat can linger for decades in those things." "Possibly," Sorrenti conceded, though she looked unconvinced. "But the periodicity of the energy signature is unusual for simple residual heat." They finally reached what must have been the bridge. It offered a panoramic, if bleak, view of the icebreaker graveyard. Shattered windows were boarded up with mismatched pieces of metal and frozen tarpaulins, but enough gaps remained to survey their surroundings. The Lenin sat a few hundred meters away, a hulking, shadowed mass, its distinct triple reactor casing visible even in the dim light. Other, smaller vessels lay trapped around them like dead fish. The bridge itself was a wreck. Consoles were smashed, seats torn, dials shattered. A thick layer of frost covered everything, sparkling faintly in the beams of their lights. And here, too, were bodies. 3 of them, frozen in their duty positions. One at the helm, slumped over the wheel, arms outstretched as if trying to steer the ship away from its icy doom. 2 others at navigation stations, their faces turned towards the windows, expressions of frozen horror locked onto their features. Unlike the sailor in the mess hall, these bodies were not fully encased in ice, but rather freeze-dried, their skin like taut, discolored parchment stretched over bone. The air around them crackled with the Geiger counters. "More samples for your collection, Doctor," Var said, his voice grim. Sorrenti approached cautiously, her scanner active. "The radiation levels are extreme around these individuals. They must have been exposed to a massive dose very quickly." She pointed to the figure at the helm. "Look at his hands, the skin. It's almost vitrified around the controls." Var looked. The man's gloved hands were indeed fused to the icy metal of the wheel, the material of the gloves blackened and brittle, as if exposed to intense heat. A low, almost subaudible hum seemed to emanate from the forward console, where the helmsman was frozen. Kim's voice broke the tense silence. "Var, Sorrenti, you guys seeing the sky?" Var turned to the least obscured viewport. The perpetual twilight of the Arctic day seemed to be deepening, but in the north, a faint, ethereal green glow was beginning to shimmer against the dark clouds. The Aurora. "It's early for a strong display," Var muttered. "The atmospheric ionization is spiking," Kim reported, an edge of awe in their voice. "It's beautiful, but the radiation counters are going nuts with it. A massive proton influx. As if on cue, the low hum from the bridge console intensified. A flicker of static electricity danced across its frozen surface. The lights on Var's and Sorrenti's Geiger counters suddenly blared, their clicks accelerating into a frantic, high-pitched whine. "What the hell?" Var exclaimed, instinctively shielding his face. Sorrenti stared at her scanner, her eyes wide. Massive energy surge. It's not just atmospheric. It's coming from the ships themselves, all of them. On the bridge, the body slumped over the helm twitched. It was a small movement, a mere tremor, but in the frozen stillness of the room, it was as shocking as a gunshot. The head, encased in a frost-covered ushanka, slowly, stiffly began to lift. 2 points of pale, sickly luminescence ignited in the shadowed sockets of its eyes. A low groan, like metal grinding on metal, vibrated through the deck plates. The frozen horror on the navigator's face seemed to crack, a fissure appearing across one icy cheek, as its head, too, began to turn. The air filled with a sudden, sharp increase in the sickly, sweet chemical odor. The whispers in the steel had found a voice. Chapter 3: The Glow and the Groan. The groan from the helmsman's corpse was a horrifying, protracted sound, like air escaping a long-sealed tomb, mixed with the screech of rusting metal. Its head swiveled on a cracking, ice-encrusted neck, the twin points of pale yellow-green light in its eye sockets fixing on Var. The temperature on the bridge seemed to plummet further, a bone-deep cold that had little to do with the Arctic air. Var reacted instantly, his training kicking in. Sorrenti back, now. He brought his carbine up, the tactical light pinning the reanimating corpse. The thing pushed itself upright with agonizing slowness, its frozen limbs popping and cracking like splintering wood. Ice shards showered from its uniform. Its movements were stiff, jerky, yet imbued with an undeniable, horrifying strength as it tore its vitrified hands from the helm, leaving patches of blackened glove and flesh behind. The sickly sweet odor intensified, acrid and cloying. "Incredible," Sorrenti breathed, a strange mixture of terror and scientific fascination in her voice. She took a hesitant step backward, her scanner still aimed at the creature. The radiation. It's acting as some sort of reanimation catalyst. The cellular structure is reorganizing. Another groan, this one wetter, issued from the second reanimated corpse at the navigation station. It was trying to pull itself free from its frozen seat, its movements equally unnatural. Its eyes glowed with the same ghastly luminescence. "Less analysis, more retreating, Doctor," Var barked. He squeezed the trigger. A 3-round burst slammed into the chest of the helmsman thing. The bullets punched through the rotted fabric of its uniform and the desiccated flesh beneath, kicking up puffs of ice crystals and something dark that instantly froze. The creature barely flinched. It stumbled a step, the yellow-green light in its eyes flickering, then continued its advance, one stiff arm reaching out, fingers like icy talons. "No effect," Sorrenti stammered, her scientific detachment shattering. "But the kinetic energy." "Not enough," Var fired again, aiming for the head. The rounds hit, one striking the ushanka, another an icy cheekbone. The creature's head snapped back, but it didn't go down. It just kept coming, groaning, its internal light source pulsing. The air crackled. Var's skin prickled. The aurora outside pulsed in sympathy, a vibrant, almost violent sheet of green and violet light now dominating the northern sky. Var Sorrenti, what's happening? Kim's voice shouted over the comms, frantic. The energy readings are off the scale. It's like the whole graveyard just woke up. On the bridge, the third corpse, slumped near a shattered chart table, began to stir, its limbs twitching, its head lolling. "We're compromised," Var yelled into his mic. "Hostiles on the bridge, animated, bodies." He grabbed Sorrenti's arm, pulling her towards the stairwell. "Move." The helmsman thing was almost upon them, its glowing eyes burning into Var. He shoved Sorrenti ahead of him, then fired a sustained burst into the creature's torso again, hopping to disable it by sheer trauma. It staggered, its advance momentarily slowed, but it still didn't fall. The chemical smell was overpowering. They scrambled down the narrow, treacherous steps, the sounds of the reanimated crew scraping and groaning behind them. As they reached the lower deck, Var glanced back. The helmsman thing was at the top of the stairs, its silhouette framed against the eerie light from the bridge, its glowing eyes piercing the gloom. "The mess hall," Var decided. "The body there, we need to see if it's active too." They burst back into the officers' mess. The room was as they had left it, except the ice-encased sailor was no longer slumped against the bulkhead. The thick shell of ice around it was shattered, lying in jagged pieces on the deck. The body itself was gone. Only a dark, wet patch and a lingering, intensified radioactive signature marked where it had been. "Oh no," Sorrenti whispered, her face pale. A guttural moan echoed from the corridor leading towards the entrance. Var spun, carbine ready. Framed in the doorway, its form casting a long, distorted shadow in the dim light filtering from outside, stood the reanimated sailor. It was different from the bridge crew. Its movements were less stiff, almost fluid, and the glow emanating from within its body was brighter, a more intense, sickly yellow-green. Its skin seemed to shimmer, as if coated in a layer of radioactive frost. These were the hot core, husks in their terrifying glory. "Kim, Croft," Var shouted into his comm. "Get the chopper ready for emergency evac. We have multiple hostiles, reanimated, repeat, reanimated dead. There, glowing." Croft's voice was a high-pitched squeal. "Reanimated? What are you talking about? This is impossible. Is this some kind of joke, Var?" "Does this sound like a joke, you imbecile?" Var snarled. The glowing sailor took a shambling step into the room, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its jaw slack. Its eyes were pools of the same dreadful light. The creature lunged. Var fired. The bullet struck its chest, and this time there was a more noticeable effect. The creature recoiled, a hissing sound escaping it like steam from superheated metal. Patches of its skin seemed to slough off where the bullets hit, revealing something dark and pulsing beneath. But it didn't go down. It regained its balance and came on again, faster this time. Sorrenti screamed as it swiped at her with a hand that looked more like a bundle of frozen, irradiated sticks. Var pushed her aside, firing point-blank into the creature's face. The head snapped back violently. The glow in its eyes dimmed for a second, then flared again. From the corridor behind them, from the direction of the bridge, came more groans and the scraping sounds of movement. They were being boxed in. "The other exit," Var yelled, pointing to a door on the far side of the mess hall he hadn't checked. "Sorrenti, go." He laid down, suppressing fire, forcing the glowing sailor back a few steps, then turned and followed Sorrenti. The door was rusted shut. Var slammed his boot against it. Once. Twice. On the third kick, the rusted latch gave way with a screech, and the door flew inward. Darkness, and another blast of the sweet chemical stench. "Kim, what's your status?" Var panted as they plunged into the new passage. "Trying to get Dmitri to spool up," Kim's voice was strained. "But the electronics in the chopper are going haywire. Everything's flickering. The Aurora. It's like it's directly overhead now, Var. It's messing with everything." They stumbled through a series of smaller cabins and storage rooms, the sounds of pursuit close behind. The groans of the reanimated were multiplying, echoing through the metallic guts of the ship. Each new corridor seemed to bring them closer to more of the things. Their Geiger counters were a constant, shrieking alarm. They emerged into a larger space, a cargo hold perhaps, littered with frozen crates and debris. Several figures were shambling amongst the shadows, their bodies emitting that same, terrifying internal glow. Hot core husks, more of them. They turned as one towards Var and Sorrenti, their movements jerky but purposeful. "Surrounded," Sorrenti gasped, her breath catching in her throat. One of the husks, larger than the others, its uniform shredded to reveal patches of glowing, irradiated flesh, let out a guttural roar and charged. Var fired, but his magazine was running low. He cursed, dropping the spent magazine and fumbling for a fresh one, his fingers clumsy in the thick gloves. The creature was almost on him. Suddenly, a section of the deck plating near the charging husk buckled upwards with a deafening screech of tortured metal. A massive, dark shape erupted from below. It wasn't human. It was a colossal Arctic wolf, but horribly mutated. Its fur was patchy, revealing tumorous, glowing green muscle tissue. Its eyes burned with an orange luminescence. One side of its jaw was distended, revealing rows of needle-sharp, blackened teeth. It let out a howl that was half animalistic rage, half something else, something resonant and deeply wrong. The tundra wolf scourge in its horrifying debut ignored Var and Sorrenti. It slammed into the charging husk, jaws snapping, tearing at the glowing flesh. The husk shrieked, a sound that was shockingly human as the wolf tore a chunk from its shoulder. Radioactive ichor, glowing faintly, splattered onto the deck. Var stared, momentarily stunned by the new horror. The wolf and the husk were locked in a grotesque battle, the wolf tearing and biting, the husk flailing with its irradiated limbs, its touch seeming to cause the wolf's fur to smolder where it connected. The energy spike. It didn't just reanimate the human dead, Sorrenti whispered, her voice filled with a horrified awe. It's affecting the local fauna too. The distraction, however horrific, was an opportunity. "This way," Var yelled, grabbing Sorrenti and pulling her towards a narrow ladder leading upwards. Hopping it led to the outer deck. They had to get out of the ship back to the helicopter, if it could even fly. As they scrambled up the ladder, the sounds of the fight below, the wolf's savage snarls, the husk's unearthly shrieks were joined by more groans. More of the glowing dead were converging on the cargo hold, drawn by the commotion. The Arctica was a charnel house, and the Aurora pulsed above, bathing the entire graveyard in its baleful, reanimating light. The initial objective of assessing the Lenin was a distant, ludicrous memory. Survival was the only mission now. Chapter 4: Retreat and Realization. The latter spat them out onto the exposed main deck of the Arctica, into the teeth of a biting wind that carried fine, stinging particles of ice. The Aurora blazed across the sky, a vast, undulating curtain of green, violet, and blood-red light, so intense it cast flickering, ghostly shadows across the snow-covered deck. It was beautiful and terrifying, a celestial announcement of the nightmare unfolding below. Var scanned their surroundings, carbine sweeping. The deck was a treacherous landscape of frozen machinery, buckled plates, and deep drifts of snow. The helicopter, their only lifeline, was a small, dark shape on the ice about 100 meters away. Between them and it, figures were moving. Glowing figures. At least a dozen hot-core husks were shambling across the ice pack, drawn from the other derelict icebreakers by the same energy pulse that had awakened the horrors within the Arctica. They moved with that same jerky, unnatural gait, their internal luminescence cutting through the Arctic twilight, turning the snow around them a sickly green. "Damn it," Var hissed, reloading his carbine with his last full magazine. "They're coming from all the ships." "The entire graveyard is active," Sorrenti confirmed, her voice trembling slightly, but her eyes still held a spark of scientific fixation as she watched the approaching husks. "This is a widespread phenomenon. The scale—" "Kim, Croft, can you see them?" Var yelled into his comm. "We're on the main deck, east side. We have multiple hostiles closing on the chopper from the surrounding vessels." Static answered him for a moment, then Kim's voice laced with panic. "We see them, Var, there. They're everywhere, Dmitri, trying to get the rotors going, but the controls are fried. The EMP from that Aurora pulse, or whatever it was, it's crippled us." Var's blood ran cold. No evac, they were stranded. Croft's wail cut through the comms. "Crippled? What do you mean crippled? We have to get out of here. Get us out of here, Var." "Shut up, Croft," Var snapped. He looked at Sorrenti. Her face was grim. The realization of their predicament was sinking in. "We need to find a defensible position. Back inside is a death trap." A husk on the deck of the Arctica, one that must have climbed up from another access point, let out a guttural groan and began to shamble towards them. It was closer than the ones on the ice. Var raised his carbine. "Hold your fire," a new voice, rough and accented, crackled over Var's comm unit, startling them both. It was Kim or Croft. "Don't waste bullets on the ones you can avoid. You need to move. Now towards the stern." Var and Sorrenti exchanged bewildered glances. "Who is this?" Var demanded. "Someone who doesn't want to see more fresh meat for the glowworms," the voice replied. "Stern. There's a breached cargo hatch. Get inside. I'll cover you from the Sevmorput." Var looked towards the Sevmorput, Another large icebreaker lying parallel to the Arctica, separated by about 50 meters of open ice. He couldn't see anyone, but the voice sounded like it knew what it was talking about. And they had no other options. The husk on deck was closing, and more were lumbering across the ice towards the Arctica's gangway. "Move, Sorrenti," Var ordered. He fired a short burst at the approaching husk, hitting it in the legs. It stumbled, its advance slowing, but didn't stop. They ran, slipping and sliding on the icy deck, towards the stern of the ship. The wind tore at them, the Aurora pulsed malevolently above, and the groans of the approaching husks seemed to be coming from every direction. A sharp crack, distinct from Var's carbine fire, echoed from the direction of the Sevmorput. The husk on the Arctica's deck, the one Var had shot in the legs, suddenly had its head explode in a shower of frozen gore and sickly light. It crumpled to the deck, its internal glow fading rapidly. A sniper. "Told you, move," the voice urged over the comms. They reached the stern. A large cargo hatch was indeed partially open, twisted metal gaping like a wound in the ship's side. It offered a dark, uncertain refuge. "In," Var said, gesturing Sorrenti through. He covered her, then scrambled in himself, landing heavily on a pile of frozen debris inside. The space was dark, smelling strongly of brine and decay, but at least it offered temporary shelter from the wind and the immediate threat on deck. The sniper fired again. Another crack, another husk on the ice pack crumpling, its headlamp eyes extinguishing. Whoever this was, they were good. "Who are you?" Var asked again into his comm, his breath rasping. "Name's Orion Gale. Used to run with a salvage crew. Patched to my friends if I had any left." The voice was weary. "Been watching this place for a long time. Knew it was bad. Didn't know it was this bad." "You've seen these things before?" Sorrenti asked, her voice breathless as she leaned against a frozen bulkhead. "Seen the bodies. Seen the lights in the sky make them twitch. Never seen a full-blown resurrection party like this, though. That Aurora, it's the key. Strongest I've seen in years, must have given them a real jolt." Var processed this. A local, a scavenger, someone who knew the lay of the land and the dangers, a potential ally or another threat. Why help us? "Professional courtesy," Patch's voice was dry. "And maybe you city folk have something that can actually put these bastards down for good. My rifle ammo is finite, and I don't fancy being their next glow stick." "Our helicopter is disabled," Var stated. "Electronics are fried." "Figured as much," Patch said. "Happens every time the sky bleeds like that. Nothing with a microchip works right for a while. You're stuck here with me and the welcoming committee." Sorrenti was running her scanner despite the gloom. "The radiation levels in this hold are lower than the upper decks. Shielded, perhaps, but the biological signatures are everywhere. Faint, but present." "This whole ship is a tomb, Doctor," Var said. He looked around the hold. It was vast, filled with shadowy shapes of machinery and cargo under tarpaulins, all coated in frost. Multiple levels of catwalks ringed the upper portions. Countless places for things to hide. "We need to regroup with my team at the chopper," Var said. "Kim and Croft are still there, and the pilot, Dimitri." Bad idea, Patch countered immediately. That chopper's out in the open. The glowworms will be all over it like flies on. Well, you get the picture. Your friends are either dead or about to be. Var's jaw tightened. He wouldn't abandon his people, but Patch's assessment was brutally logical. We need to try. Suit yourself, Patch said. But you go out there now, you're walking into a feast. You need a better plan and more firepower. A series of thuds and scrapes echoed from the deck above them. The husks were searching. One of them, perhaps the one whose head Patch had exploded, had colleagues. They know we're in here, Sorrenti whispered, her eyes wide. This hold has other exits, Patch's voice came. Deeper into the ship. Or, if you're feeling suicidal, there's a maintenance ladder that leads to the outer hull, near the water line. Might be able to get across to the Sevmorput if the ice is stable there. Var considered their options, all bad. Going back out onto the deck was suicide. Staying here meant waiting for the husks to find them. Going deeper into the Arctica felt like walking further into the monster's maw. Crossing to another ship, another unknown, was a huge risk. What's on the Sevmorput? Var asked. Is it any safer? Safer is a relative term in this graveyard, friend, Patch replied. But it's where I've got my supplies, and a few surprises for our glowing friends. It's also got a manual radio, shielded. Might be your only chance of calling for help if anyone's listening. A manual radio. That was a sliver of hope. Modern comms were useless, but an old, robust system might just work. The thuds from above grew louder, more insistent. A low, collective groaning sound vibrated through the hull. Decision time, Var, Patch said, his voice grim. They're zeroing in. Var looked at Sorrenti. Her face was pale but resolute. She nodded once. The radio is our best option, the data I've collected. It needs to get out. Even now, her scientific imperative was strong. All right, Patch, Var said into his comm. How do we get to your ship? There's a service tunnel that runs between the lower engine rooms of the Arctica and the Sevmorput, Patch explained. Supposedly sealed off when they decommission these rust buckets. But seals break, especially down here. It'll be tight, dark, and probably full of things you don't want to meet. But it's your best shot at avoiding the welcoming committee topside. Deeper into the darkness it was. The realization was stark. The initial horror of the reanimated dead was just the beginning. They were in a battle of attrition, against not just the glowing revenants, but against the crushing cold, the insidious radiation, and the decaying, treacherous labyrinth of the icebreaker graveyard itself. And now, their survival depended on a cynical scavenger and a desperate journey through the guts of these dead ships. Chapter 5: The Conductor's Symphony. The access to the service tunnel is on the lowest deck. Patch's voice guided them, tinny and distant through Var's comm. Engine room 3. Look for a sealed hatch with a red warning stencil, or what's left of it. Navigating the lower decks of the Arctica was like descending into a frozen metallic hell. The air grew colder, heavier, thick with the smell of decay, oil, and the persistent, sickly sweet tang of the revenants. Their lights cut feeble swaths through the oppressive darkness, revealing labyrinthine corridors, cramped machinery spaces, and flooded compartments where black, ice-skimmed water reflected their beams like dead eyes. The groans and scraping sounds of the hot core husks were a constant accompaniment, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close. Var moved with grim efficiency, Sorrenti close behind, her scanner still active, her breath plumbing in the frigid air. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every echo sounded like a footfall. They found Engine Room 3. It was a vast, cathedral-like space, filled with the silent, looming shapes of colossal diesel engines, coated in decades of grime and frost. Catwalks crisscrossed the upper reaches, disappearing into darkness. The ambient radiation here was significantly higher. The clicks of their Geiger counters a frantic, incessant chorus. "The hatch should be on the far bulkhead port side," Patch directed. They picked their way across the slippery, oil-stained deck, past motionless PISTONS Tylettery 43, Tylettery 2B, Tylettery 0D as men. The silence in the engine room was unnerving, a heavy, watchful quiet that felt different from the creaks and groans elsewhere. Sorrenti paused, her scanner pointed towards a dark alcove between two massive engine blocks. "Var, I'm getting a concentrated energy signature, very localized and rhythmic." Var tensed, hostile. I don't know, it's not like the husks, it's more complex, almost like a signal." As she spoke, a low, metallic banging sound echoed from the direction of the alcove. 1, 2, 3 distinct raps, then a pause, then 3 more. It was deliberate, intelligent. From the darkness of the alcove, a figure emerged. It was tall, more imposing than the other husks they had encountered. It wore the tattered, oil-stained remnants of a chief engineer's uniform, the insignia barely visible beneath a patina of grime and frost. Its body emitted a dull, pulsating red glow, like the dying embers of a furnace, less intense than the yellow-green of the other husks, but somehow more menacing. In one hand, it gripped a heavy, industrial wrench, its surface scarred and blackened by radiation. Its head was mostly skeletal, patches of desiccated flesh clinging to bone, but its eyes burned with a malevolent crimson light, and they fixed on Var and Sorrenti with an undeniable awareness. This was not a mindless shambler. This was the conductor. Chief Engineer Volkov, as he once was, or the revenant that now inhabited his form, raised the wrench and banged it again on a nearby pipe. 3 times. From the shadowy catwalks above and from the dark spaces between the engines came answering groans. The hot core husks. They were responding to his signal. "He's controlling them," Sorrenti breathed, her voice a mixture of terror and disbelief. The conductor took a stiff, deliberate step forward, then another. He moved with a ponderous, mechanical grace that was utterly chilling. He pointed the wrench at Var, then at Sorrenti, as if identifying his targets. Then he let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate in Var's very bones. Around them, from the darkness, the yellow-green lights of multiple husks began to appear. They shambled forward, emerging from behind machinery, dropping from catwalks with sickening thuds, their movements clumsy but relentless, all converging on Var and Sorrenti, guided by their crimson-eyed master. "The hatch, Sorrenti, find it." Var yelled, opening fire on the closest husks. His bullets tore through them, making them stagger and hiss, but there were too many. For every one he momentarily disabled, two more seemed to take its place. The conductor watched, unmoving, his red eyes glowing, the wrench held ready. He seemed to be orchestrating the attack, a conductor leading his grotesque symphony of death. Sorrenti frantically swept her light along the far bulkhead. There, I see it, a red stencil. It was a heavy, circular hatch, its surface blistered with rust, the warning symbols faded but still visible. A large wheel, presumably for sealing it, was frozen in place. "Cover me," Var shouted, laying down suppressing fire as Sorrenti rushed to the hatch. He was backing up, trying to keep the encroaching husks at bay, but they were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. One got too close, swiping at him with a glowing hand. Var felt an intense, searing pain as its touch grazed his arm, even through the thick layers of his parka. The fabric smoldered, and the chemical stench intensified. "Og!" he kicked out, sending the husk stumbling back, then fired a point-blank burst into its chest. The creature hissed and fell, its light dimming, but another was already taking its place. Sorrenti was struggling with the hatch wheel. "It's frozen solid," she gasped, her breath clouding around her. The conductor began to move, lumbering forward with surprising speed for his size, the heavy wrench raised. He was coming for them directly. "Patch, we're pinned down in engine room 3. The conductor is here." Var yelled into his comm, hoping the scavenger could offer some kind of support, though he knew it was unlikely. The conductor, Patch's voice was grim, Volkov, knew he'd be the one calling the shots if any of them kept their brains. He was a mean bastard even when he was alive. "Get that hatch open, Var. He's not like the others, he's smart, and he's strong." Var dodged another grasping, glowing hand, firing his carbine until it clicked empty. Reloading. He dropped to one knee, fumbling with his last few spare rounds, his fingers stiff with cold and adrenaline. The husks were closing in, their groans a deafening chorus. The conductor was only meters away, his crimson eyes burning with cold malice. Sorrenti, with a desperate cry, put her shoulder into the hatch wheel and heaved with all her might. There was a hideous screech of tortured metal, a shower of rust and ice, and the wheel moved, just a fraction. "Almost got it," she panted. The conductor was upon Var. He swung the massive wrench in a deadly arc. Var threw himself sideways, the wrench whistling past his head, close enough for him to feel the disturbed air and smell the radiation emanating from the Revenant engineer. The wrench slammed into a steel support pillar with a deafening clang, sending sparks flying. Var scrambled back, bringing his partially reloaded carbine up. He fired a short burst into the conductor's chest. The Revenant barely flinched, the red glow from its torso pulsing. It turned, its movements stiff but powerful, and advanced on him again. "The hatch is open," Sorrenti screamed. A narrow, dark opening was now visible. "Go, go," Var yelled, firing his last few rounds at the conductor, trying to slow him down. The bullets sparked off the Revenant's frame or punched through its desiccated flesh with little apparent effect. Sorrenti squeezed through the opening. Var turned to follow, but a husk grabbed his leg, its touch like burning ice. He kicked it away, then another lunged at him from the side. He was being overwhelmed. Suddenly, a section of catwalk directly above the conductor groaned, then tore free with a deafening shriek of rending metal. It crashed down, tons of steel and ice, striking the Revenant engineer with tremendous force. The conductor roared, a sound of fury and agony as he was driven to his knees, half buried under the debris. His crimson eyes still blazed, but his advance was, for the moment, halted. Var didn't question his luck. He threw himself towards the hatch, diving headfirst into the oppressive darkness of the service tunnel, just as the first of the pursuing husks reached the opening. He heard their frustrated groans and the scraping of their claws on the metal as Sorrenti, from inside the tunnel, somehow managed to heave the heavy hatch wheel, pulling the door partially closed with a resounding clang. They were in the tunnel, alive, for now. The symphony of the damned still echoed faintly from the engine room behind them, a testament to the conductor's enduring, malevolent presence. And Var knew with a chilling certainty that their conductor was not finished with them yet. Chapter 6: Fractured Trust. The service tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. Barely wide enough for one person to pass comfortably, it was a tube of cold, sweating steel, ribbed and uneven underfoot. The only light came from their failing headlamps and the beam of Var's carbine, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with unseen menace. The air was foul, thick with the smell of rust, stagnant water, and the ever-present, sickly sweet odor of the Revenants, which seemed to cling to them like a shroud. Sorrenti was leaning against the curved wall, gasping for breath, her face pale in the dim light. Var checked the makeshift seal on the hatch. It was holding, but he could hear the faint, persistent scraping and thudding from the other side. The husks were trying to get through. "We need to move," Var said, his voice hoarse. He checked his arm where the husk had grazed him. The fabric of his parka was blackened and brittle. Beneath his skin was an angry red already blistering, a radiation burn and a bad one. He ignored the throbbing pain. "Patch, you read me. We're in the tunnel, heading your way." "Good to hear your ugly voice, Var." Patch's reply was tinny but audible. "Keep moving. Tunnel should be clear for a while. Most of those things don't like tight spaces if they can help it. But don't dawdle. That big bastard, Volkov, the conductor, he won't give up easy." "He's intelligent," Sorrenti said, pushing herself off the wall. "He was coordinating them, using signals." "Told you he was a mean one," Patch said. "Ran that engine room like his own personal fiefdom. Probably still thinks he does." Var started down the tunnel, Sorrenti following close behind. Their footsteps echoed unnervingly in the confined space. Water dripped from unseen cracks in the ceiling, each drop sounding like a hammer blow in the tense silence. Their Geiger counters, though slightly less frantic than in the engine room, still maintained a high, steady clicking. "This radiation," Sorrenti said, her voice regaining some of its scientific composure, though an undercurrent of fear remained. "It's pervasive. We can't stay exposed like this for long. What about your team at the helicopter, Var? Kim? Croft?" Var's jaw tightened. "Once we reach Patch and secure that radio, we make a plan for them, if they're still alive." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He knew the chances were slim. They walked in silence for what felt like an eternity, the tunnel curving, rising and falling. Several times they had to squeeze past buckled sections of pipe or wade through ankle-deep pools of freezing, oily water. The constant darkness and confinement were wearing on their nerves. Sorrenti suddenly stopped. "Var, my scanner, there's something ahead." Var raised his carbine, peering into the gloom. "What is it?" "A blockage, metal, and organic readings faint, very faint." They proceeded cautiously. Around a sharp bend they found it. A section of the tunnel was almost completely blocked by a twisted mass of metal grating and what looked like frozen, solidified sludge. And protruding from the sludge, pale and skeletal, were human bones. Several hands, a rib cage, part of a skull. "Looks like some poor bastards tried this route before," Var muttered, examining the grim tableau. "And didn't make it." Sorrenti ran her scanner over the remains. Old, very old, decades at least, but the radiation signature. It's similar to the bodies we found on the Arctica. Lower concentrations, but the same isotopes. So this radiation, this reanimation phenomenon, it's not new, Var asked. "Perhaps not," Sorrenti mused. "Perhaps it's cyclical, linked to these auroral events, these energy spikes, lying dormant for years then, reactivating." Her eyes held a disturbing gleam. "The implications are astounding. A form of radiation-induced suspended animation, or necromantic energy." "Let's focus on the not getting killed by it implication for now, Doctor," Var said curtly. He examined the blockage. "We might be able to clear a path. Some of this grating looks loose." They set to work, Var using the butt of his carbine to pry at the twisted metal, Sorrenti helping where she could. It was slow, exhausting work in the cramped, freezing conditions. The sounds of their efforts echoed loudly, making Var uneasy. After nearly an hour, they had managed to clear a small opening, barely large enough to crawl through. "I'll go first," Var said. He handed Sorrenti his carbine. "Cover me from this side." He squeezed through the narrow gap, scraping his already injured arm. The space beyond was even tighter for a moment, then opened up slightly. He scanned with his headlamp. More tunnel. But the air here felt different, less stagnant, a faint draft. "Clear," he called back. "Send the weapon through." Sorrenti pushed the carbine through the gap, then began to wriggle her way after him. As she was halfway through, a low groan echoed from back down the tunnel they had just traversed, not too distant. "There in the tunnel," Var hissed, grabbing the carbine. "Hurry." Sorrenti squirmed the rest of the way through, emerging breathless and covered in grime. They must have gotten through the hatch. Or found another way in. Var didn't wait. He pushed on, faster now, a new urgency in his steps. The hope of the tunnel being a safe passage was gone. Their progress was hampered by Sorrenti. She was a scientist, not a soldier. The physical exertion, the constant fear, the radiation exposure, it was all taking its toll. She stumbled frequently, her breathing ragged. "My arm, Var," she said after one particularly bad fall, her voice strained. "The burn, it's getting worse. I can barely feel my fingers." Var examined it briefly. The redness had spread, the blisters were larger, weeping a clear fluid. It looked nasty. We need to get to Patch. He might have medical supplies. He knew, however, that for severe radiation burns, there was little that could be done in these conditions. The trust between them, always fragile, was beginning to fracture under the strain. Sorrenti's obsession with data and samples, even in the face of overwhelming danger, grated on Var's pragmatic survival instincts. His brusque, military demeanor offered little comfort to her. "If we ever get out of this," Sorrenti said, her voice bitter, "the scientific community needs to know. This phenomenon, it could rewrite our understanding of radiobiology, of life and death itself. I need my data, my scanners." She clutched the device protectively. "Your data won't do you much good if you're a glowing corpse, Doctor," Var retorted, his patience wearing thin. "Our priority is survival. Everything else is secondary." "Is it, Var?" Sorrenti challenged, her eyes flashing. "Or is your priority just following orders, fulfilling your security contract, no matter the cost to scientific discovery? What if the answers to stopping these things are in the very data you're dismissing?" Before Var could reply, Patch's voice crackled over the comms, sharp and urgent. "Var, Sorrenti, pick up the pace. I'm seeing movement on my motion sensors near the tunnel exit on this side, and it ain't me." The news sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Var. They were caught between the husks pursuing them from behind, and unknown threats ahead. The fragile alliance, the fractured trust, all of it was secondary to the immediate, visceral need to escape the closing jaws of the trap. The service tunnel, their supposed sanctuary, had become just another hunting ground. Chapter 7: The Larder of the Lost. "How far to the exit, Patch?" Var demanded, pushing Sorrenti forward, his senses on high alert. The tunnel ahead was still a black maw. "You're close, maybe 50 meters. It opens into a lower storage hold on the Sevmore put. I'm in the workshop above, but you need to hurry. I've got 3. No, 4 heat signatures converging on that exit, and they ain't glowing like the usual husks." Not husks. What else was down here? Mutated animals, or something else. Var didn't like the sound of it. He urged Sorrenti on, his own injured arm throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. The air in the tunnel was growing colder, and he could feel a stronger draft, carrying with it new, unpleasant scents, something like rotten meat, overlaid with a sharp, coppery tang. They rounded a final bend and saw it, a faint, rectangular patch of lesser darkness ahead. The tunnel exit. But framed within it, Var could make out shapes. Low, hunched figures, moving with an unnerving speed and silence that was distinctly non-human. "Patch, what are we dealing with?" Var whispered into his comm, slowing their approach. "Can't get a clear visual from here. Small, fast, maybe those rime worms I've seen around. Or could be some of those mutated foxes. Nasty biters, those." As they got closer, Var's headlamp picked out more detail. They were indeed some kind of mutated canid, smaller than the tundra wolf scourge but wiry and quick. Their fur shimmered with faint, shifting colors like a diseased rainbow the Aurora touched fox's Patch had mentioned. Their eyes glowed with a faint, unsettling silver light, and their snouts were wet, twitching as they sniffed the air. There were 4 of them, blocking the tunnel exit, their heads cocked as if listening to Var and Sorrenti's approach. "Foxes," Var confirmed. "They don't look friendly." "They ain't," Patch's voice was grim. "Bite will make you see things that ain't there. Then you'll wish they were, try to scare 'em off. They're usually skittish unless they're starving, which around here they usually are." The foxes let out a series of high-pitched, chittering yelps, their silver eyes fixed on Var and Sorrenti. They didn't look skittish. They looked hungry. Var raised his carbine. He didn't want to fire in the confined space if he could avoid it. The ricochets would be unpredictable. "Get back!" he yelled, taking a step forward. The foxes snarled, baring needle-sharp teeth. One of them, bolder than the others, darted forward, a shimmering blur. Var fired a single shot into the ground in front of it. The bullet sparked and the fox leaped back with a yelp, but the others held their ground, their yips growing more agitated. "Not working, Patch." "Plan B then, create a distraction. I'm opening the whole door from up here. When they look, you run for the ladder on the left. Got it?" Before Var could respond, a loud hydraulic hiss echoed from beyond the tunnel exit, followed by the groan of heavy machinery. A section of the far wall in the storage hold beyond the tunnel mouth began to retract upwards, revealing a brighter, larger space, Patch's workshop. The foxes, startled by the sudden noise and light, spun around, their attention diverted towards the opening door. "Now Var, go," Patch yelled. "Move, Sorrenti." Var shoved her towards the tunnel exit. They burst out into the storage hold, a cramped, cluttered space filled with forgotten crates and machinery. To their left, as Patch had said, was a rusty metal ladder leading up to a mezzanine where the workshop door was now open, Patch himself silhouetted against the light, rifle ready. The foxes, recovering quickly, turned back with angry snarls and darted after them. Sorrenti scrambled for the ladder. Var turned to cover her, firing a short burst at the lead fox. It yelped and tumbled, its shimmering fur stained dark, but another one leaped, incredibly fast, and sank its teeth into Var's already injured arm. An explosion of agony, far worse than the husk's burn, shot through Var. It wasn't just the teeth. It was an intense, biting cold, accompanied by a strange, dizzying sensation. He roared, shaking his arm violently, and the fox, yelping, was flung off, but not before its toxic saliva had entered his wound. Patch fired from the mezzanine. The bullet caught the leaping fox in midair, sending it spinning. The remaining 2 foxes, momentarily deterred by the gunfire and the loss of their packmates, hesitated. "Var, up now!" Sorrenti screamed from the top of the ladder. Var, his vision blurring slightly at the edges, his arm on fire with a venomous cold, staggered to the ladder and began to climb, every movement an agony. The 2 remaining foxes renewed their attack, snapping at his heels. He kicked out blindly, connecting with one, sending it tumbling back. Patch laid down covering fire, forcing the last fox to retreat into the shadows of the storage hold. Var practically fell onto the mezzanine, Sorrenti and Patch dragging him the last few feet into the workshop. Patch slammed the heavy steel door shut and threw several thick bolts into place. They were in, safe for the moment. The workshop was a small, cluttered space, but it was relatively warm and well lit by a single, sputtering generator. Tools lined the walls, along with salvaged equipment and stacks of supplies. A workbench was covered in disassembled electronics and weapon parts. In one corner, a crude cot was set up. It was a survivor's den. Patch, a gaunt, weathered man with a grizzled beard and a black patch over one eye, leaned his rifle against the wall and turned to Var. "Let me see that arm." Var slumped against a crate, cradling his savaged limb. The bite marks were deep, and the flesh around them was already turning a bruised, purplish color, the cold sensation spreading. His head was beginning to spin. Patch examined the wound with a practiced eye, his expression grim. "Aurora fox bite. Nasty. The cold's the least of your worries, it's the venom. You'll be seeing things soon. Things that'll make those glowworms look like welcome company." He rummaged through a battered medical kit. "Got some broad-spectrum antitoxin. Might help, might not. Depends how much got in you." Sorrenti watched, her face etched with concern, her earlier abrasiveness gone. The radiation burn underneath, the combined trauma. "Yeah, he's not having a good day," Patch said dryly, cleaning the wound with a harsh antiseptic that made Var hiss. He then administered a shot from a pre-filled syringe. "This'll either help or make you wish you were dead. 50-50. As Patch bandaged the arm, Var looked around the workshop. On one wall, pinned up with rusted nails, were several crude, hand-drawn maps of the Icebreaker graveyard, and next to them, photographs, faded, curled at the edges. Pictures of men, women, children, some in naval uniforms, some in civilian clothes, faces from the past. "Who are they?" Var asked, his voice thick. Patch glanced at the photos, his one good eye lingering on them for a moment. "Previous visitors, some were salvagers like me, some explorers, scientists like your friend here. Some were just lost souls who washed up with the ice, the graveyard. It collects them." He tapped one photo, a smiling woman in a thick parka. "That was Anya, my partner. We came here looking for a new start away from the mainland troubles. Found this instead." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but his eye held a deep sadness. "What happened to them?" Sorrenti asked softly. Patch gestured vaguely towards the door. "What happens to everyone who stays here too long? The cold, the radiation, the creatures. Or they just vanished. The Arctica, the Lenin, they're like lighthouses for the lost, and larders for the damned." Var felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature or the fox venom. The Icebreaker graveyard wasn't just a collection of derelict ships. It was a mausoleum, a trap that had claimed many before them. They were just the latest arrivals. "The radio, Patch," Var said, fighting through the rising disorientation. "We need to contact my team. We need to call for help." Patch nodded, moving towards a battered, heavy-duty radio set in the corner. "Yeah, let's see if anyone out there is listening to the screams from the larder of the lost." He began to power it up, the generator sputtering in protest. The workshop filled with the crackle of static, a hopeful sound in the overwhelming, irradiated silence of the damned. Chapter 8: Aurora's Gaze. The static crackled and hissed from the old radio, a defiant noise against the oppressive silence of the Sevmorput. Patch worked the dials with a practiced hand, his one good eye narrowed in concentration. Var, propped against a stack of salvaged crates, fought waves of nausea and disorientation. The antitoxin Patch had administered was doing little to combat the effects of the Aurora fox venom. Strange, fleeting images danced at the edges of his vision, impossible geometries, faces in the rust patterns on the wall, whispers that seemed to emanate from the very steel of the ship. Sorrenti sat nearby, meticulously cleaning her radiation scanner with a cloth, her earlier scientific detachment returning, though now tinged with a grim weariness. Her gaze kept flicking towards Var, a flicker of concern in her pale eyes. "Anything, Patch?" Var asked, his voice raspy. His injured arm throbbed, a duet of fiery radiation burn and venomous cold. "Trying to find a clear channel," Patch muttered. "This old girl's tough, but the Aurora, it's playing merry hell with the ionosphere, like trying to shout in a hurricane." He adjusted a frequency knob. The static shifted, coalesced into a faint, distorted voice. "I'll repeat, this is Arctic Monitoring Station Nordvik. Does anyone copy? We are experiencing severe atmospheric interference. Unidentified energy signatures detected, originating from sector. Static. Graveyard." "Nordvik," Var exclaimed, trying to sit up straighter. "That's a manned station, north of here. Patch, can you boost the signal?" "Trying." Patch fine-tuned the receiver. The voice faded in and out, buried under layers of noise. "Reports of anomalous sightings. Recommend all maritime and air traffic avoid. Static. Extreme radiation hazard." "They know something's wrong," Sorrenti said, leaning closer to the radio. "They might be able to send help." Patch switched to transmit. Nordvik Station, this is civilian vessel Sevmorput actual in the Icebreaker graveyard. Do you copy? Over." He repeated the call several times, only static answered. Then faintly, "Sevmorput, your signal is broken, unreadable, state your." Static. "We are stranded," Patch shouted into the microphone. "Survivors of expedition. Require immediate evacuation. Hostile. Reanimated entities. Helicopter disabled. Radiation levels critical. Do you copy, Nordvik?" A long burst of static, then for a moment clear as a bell. "Understand. Reanimated. Sending signal location. Rescue attempt. Not possible at this time. Conditions too hazardous. Repeat, rescue not." Static. "Godspeed." The signal died, swallowed by a deafening roar of white noise. Patch slammed his fist on the console. "Damn it, they heard us. They know where we are, but they can't get through." "Not possible at this time," Var repeated, a cold dread settling in his stomach. "Conditions too hazardous." That meant they were on their own, completely. Sorrenti looked devastated. "No rescue." "Not today, it seems," Patch said grimly. He switched off the radio. "Saves on the generator fuel anyway." He looked at Var. "How you feeling, city boy? Seeing pink elephants yet?" Var shook his head, trying to clear the swirling patterns in his vision. "Just distorted, and the whispers." "Yeah, that's the venom kicking in good and proper," Patch said. "It'll get worse before it gets better, if it gets better." He picked up his rifle. "I'm going to check the perimeter, make sure no more of those furry little bastards or their bigger, glowing cousins are sniffing around." He paused at the door. "You too. Try not to kill each other while I'm gone." He slipped out, the heavy door thudding shut behind him. Silence descended, broken only by Var's labored breathing and the hum of the generator. Sorrenti finally put down her scanner. "Var," she began, her voice hesitant, "about what I said in the tunnel, about the data." "Forget it, Doctor," Var said, his voice weary. "Right now, none of it matters." "But it does," she insisted, a flicker of her earlier intensity returning. "Don't you see this reanimation? It's tied to the radiation, yes, but also to the Aurora. The energy signatures are almost identical during the peak displays. It's like the Aurora itself is a conduit or a catalyst, if we could understand the mechanism." Var stared at her. Even now, even after everything they'd seen, her mind was still trying to dissect the horror, to categorize it. He had to admit, though, her words resonated with what Kim had said about the chopper's electronics failing during the Aurora's peak. "The Aurora Phantom," Var murmured, remembering the colossal, vague silhouette he'd thought he'd seen in the lights. He dismissed it as a trick of the eye, fatigue, the onset of the venom. But now— "What did you say?" Sorrenti asked. Var described what he'd seen, or thought he'd seen. The shadowy figure within the Aurora, its perceived gaze. Sorrenti listened intently, her eyes wide. A focused energy manifestation, a sentient, atmospheric phenomenon. That would explain the directed nature of the energy pulse, the way it seems to target the dead, and perhaps the living. She shivered. The Aurora's gaze. It's not just a poetic fancy, is it? Suddenly, Var's vision swam violently. The rust patterns on the steel wall opposite him seemed to writhe and coalesce, forming a grotesque, leering face. The whispers intensified, speaking in a language he didn't understand, yet which filled him with a profound, primal dread. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands to his temples. "Var, are you all right?" Sorrenti's voice sounded distant, distorted. He opened his eyes. Sorrenti was looking at him with alarm. But behind her, standing in the corner of the workshop, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, wrapped in decaying furs. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Var knew with a sickening certainty that it was one of the figures from Patch's photographs. The woman, Anya. Her eyes seemed to glow with a faint, sorrowful light. "Anya," Var croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Sorrenti spun around. "What? Who's Anya? There's no one there, Var." The spectral figure of Anya raised a hand, pointing towards the door. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Or perhaps Var just couldn't hear it over the roaring in his own head. She's warning us," Var stammered, his heart pounding. "The venom. It had to be the venom." But the apparition looked so real, so solid. The heavy workshop door suddenly rattled violently, as if struck by a massive blow from the outside. Then again. A deep, guttural groan echoed through the steel, a sound Var recognized with a sickening lurch. "The conductor." Patch burst back into the workshop, his face grim. "Trouble, big trouble. Volkov's found us, and he's brought friends." He slammed the bolts home again, then dragged a heavy metal cabinet in front of the door. "That won't hold him for long." The door buckled under another tremendous impact, the steel groaning in protest. The conductor's furious roars were now clearly audible, accompanied by the chorus of groans from other husks. Sorrenti stared at the door, her face ashen. How did he find us so quickly? Var looked at the spot where the spectral Anya had stood. It was empty. Had she truly warned them? Or was his mind just playing cruel tricks? The Aurora, Sorrenti whispered, her eyes fixed on a small, grimy porthole in the workshop wall. Through it, the sky outside pulsed with an almost unbearable intensity, the colors shifting, writhing like a living entity. Its gaze, it sees everything. The door buckled again. A hinge tore loose with a screech of tortured metal. The conductor's crimson eyes, burning with malevolent fury, appeared in the gap. He was learning. He was adapting. And he was relentless. The Aurora's gaze seemed to be focused directly on their small, fragile sanctuary, guiding its terrible servant. Chapter 9: The Iron Maze. "He's through," Patch yelled as the workshop door finally gave way with a deafening crash, torn from its remaining hinges by the conductor's relentless assault. The heavy cabinet Patch had braced against it was thrown aside like a child's toy. The conductor stood framed in the ruined doorway, his crimson eyes burning, the heavy wrench in his hand dripping with something dark and viscous. Behind him, the yellow-green glow of several hot core husks illuminated the corridor. Volkov let out a triumphant, guttural roar that was more animal than human. "Sorrenti, the escape hatch," Patch shouted, shoving his rifle into Var's hands. "You know the way, go, I'll buy you some time." He grabbed a heavy crowbar from the workbench and stood his ground, a desperate, defiant figure against the tide of glowing death. Var, his mind a maelstrom of venom-induced hallucinations and adrenaline, barely registered the exchange. The spectral Anya flickered at the edge of his vision, her silent warnings now mixed with images of a younger, smiling Patch. He gripped the rifle, its familiar weight a small anchor in the chaos. Sorrenti grabbed Var's good arm. "Var, come on. There's a maintenance shaft behind those supply crates." Her voice was shrill with panic, but she was moving, pulling him towards the back of the workshop. The conductor lumbered forward, swinging his wrench. Patch met the blow with his crowbar, the clang of metal on metal echoing through the small space. The force of the impact sent shivers up Patch's arms, but he held his ground, gritting his teeth. The husks behind Volkov began to pour into the workshop. Var, jolted into action by Sorrenti's pull, turned and fired the rifle at the encroaching husks, the shots deafening in the confined space. He saw one go down, its light extinguishing, then another stumble. But more kept coming. "The shaft, Var!" Sorrenti screamed, pointing to a barely visible, low opening behind a stack of oiled drums. Patch roared as the conductor's wrench connected with his shoulder, drawing a cry of pain. He staggered back but swung the crowbar again, aiming for the Revenant's legs. "Go, get out of here." Var knew they couldn't leave him, but he also knew Patch was buying them their only chance. He fired another burst, then turned and scrambled towards the opening with Sorrenti. It was a tight squeeze, leading into a narrow, vertical shaft filled with pipes and conduits. A rusty ladder was bolted to one side. "Down," Sorrenti urged, already starting to descend. Var hesitated at the top, looking back. Patch was fighting like a cornered animal, the crowbar a blur, but he was being overwhelmed. The conductor, shrugging off Patch's blows, raised his wrench for a final, devastating strike. "Patch!" Var yelled, aiming the rifle, but his vision swam, the target blurring. The spectral Anya was screaming silently beside him. A husk lunged at Patch from the side, its glowing claws tearing at his leg. Patch cried out and fell to one knee. The conductor's wrench came down. Var fired blindly, then threw himself into the shaft, Sorrenti's scream echoing from below. He landed heavily, pain shooting up his legs, and started to scramble down the ladder after her. The sounds of the fight in the workshop abruptly cut off as they descended into the metallic guts of the Sevmorput. The maintenance shaft was a disorienting vertical maze. They descended through deck after deck, the only light coming from their failing headlamps, the air thick with the smell of old machinery and something else, something organic and rotting. Groans and scraping sounds echoed from connecting ducts and crawl spaces. The entire ship seemed to be infested. "Which way?" Var panted as they reached a junction where the shaft split. His head was pounding, the hallucinations growing more vivid. The walls seemed to breathe, the pipes to writhe like metallic serpents. Sorrenti consulted a small, laminated map Patch must have given her. "This way should lead to the lower cargo holds." Patch said there might be an auxiliary access to the Lenin service corridors from there, if the ice has shifted right. The Lenin, their original, now almost mythical objective. It seemed insane to even consider it, but it was the only direction Patch had offered. They navigated a bewildering series of crawl spaces, ventilation shafts, and narrow catwalks over dark, echoing chasms. Several times they encountered husks, their telltale glow appearing suddenly in the darkness. Each encounter was a desperate, close-quarters fight, Var's dwindling ammunition and venom-impaired aim making every shot a gamble. Sorrenti, despite her fear, proved surprisingly resilient, using her knowledge of the ship's layout from Patch's maps to guide them, and even wielding a heavy wrench she'd picked up as a crude weapon. The hallucinations were Var's constant companions. Patch's spectral form walked beside him, offering grim advice. The frozen sailors from the Arctica's bridge pointed down corridors with their icy fingers. Anya's sorrowful face appeared in pools of oily water. He fought to distinguish reality from illusion, but the lines were blurring. Once, cornered in a narrow conduit by two husks, Var saw the conductor's crimson eyes burning at him from the darkness ahead, even though he knew the Revenant engineer couldn't possibly be there. He fired wildly, and Sorrenti had to drag him back, screaming that there was nothing there. "Var, you have to focus," she pleaded, her face pale and streaked with grime. "The venom, it's taking you." He knew she was right. He was becoming a liability. His strength was failing, his mind fracturing. They stumbled into what Sorrenti identified as a secondary cargo hold. It was vast, dark, and filled with the shadowy shapes of enormous, crated machinery. And it was not empty. Dozens of yellow-green lights flickered in the darkness like malevolent fireflies. A low, collective groaning filled the air. Husks, many of them, And in the center of the hold, standing on a raised platform as if surveying his domain, was the conductor. This time he was real. His crimson eyes found them immediately. He raised his wrench and let out a sound that was not quite a roar, not quite a groan, but something in between a summons. The husks began to converge, shambling out from behind crates, dropping from overhead gantries, a relentless, glowing tide. He followed us, Sorrenti whispered, her voice filled with despair. Or he knew where we'd be. He's hunting us, Var said, his voice flat. The spectral patch nodded grimly beside him. This was it. The iron maze had led them to its master. The conductor pointed his wrench towards a massive, sealed bulkhead at the far end of the cargo hold. The bulkhead bore the faded stencil of the Lenin. He wants us to go there, Sorrenti realized. He's hurting us. Why, what was on the Lenin that the conductor wanted them to reach? Or was it simply a trap, the final stage of his horrifying hunt? There was no time to ponder. The husks were closing in, their groans filling the vast space, their sickly sweet stench overwhelming. Var raised his rifle, its barrel nearly empty. Sorrenti clutched her wrench, her knuckles white. The iron maze had run out of turns. They were trapped, with the master of the damned and his legion blocking their only apparent path. Chapter 10. The Heart of the Coldfire. The vast cargo hold of the Sevmorput had become an arena of death. The conductor, a crimson-eyed sentinel on his raised platform, directed his legion of hot-core husks with guttural commands and gestures of his radiation-scarred wrench. The yellow-green glow of the approaching Revenants cast eerie, dancing shadows across the crated machinery, their collective groans a hellish chorus. Var, his mind a battlefield of venom-induced phantoms and grim reality, knew this was a fight they couldn't win. He had maybe a dozen rounds left. Sorrenti, armed only with a heavy wrench, was no match for even one of these things. The bulkhead, the Lenin, Sorrenti said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. He's not just hurting us, Var. He needs us to go there, or something on the Lenin needs us. The spectral image of Anya, her face sorrowful, flickered beside Var, her translucent hand pointing towards the Lenin bulkhead. Patch's ghostly form nodded in agreement. The old flagship. She always was a jealous bitch. Never liked anyone messing with her guts. What are you talking about? Var muttered, unsure if he was speaking to Sorrenti or the phantoms. The reactor core, Var, Sorrenti exclaimed, her eyes alight with a terrifying understanding. The Lenin had 3 experimental OK-900 reactors, even decommissioned if one of them is breached or still holds a critical mass. It could be the epicenter of this phenomenon, the heart of the cold fire, so to speak, the source of the energy that animates them. The conductor let out another commanding roar. The husks surged forward. Var fired, aiming carefully, making each shot count. 2 husks went down, their lights sputtering out. But there were too many. He saw Sorrenti swing her wrench with desperate force, connecting with a husk's arm, the impact jarring her. If we can reach the primary control room of the Lenin, Sorrenti yelled over the din, if the systems aren't completely fried, there might be a way to initiate a full containment scram. Or or overload it. Create a localized radiation pulse so intense it burns out whatever animates them. It was an insane, desperate gamble, but it was the only plan they had, and the conductor, for reasons of his own, seemed to want them to go that way. "All right, Doctor," Var shouted. "Lead the way, I'll cover our retreat." He slammed a fresh, pitifully small magazine into his carbine. Sorrenti didn't hesitate. She dodged a grasping husk and sprinted towards the Lenin bulkhead, Var following, firing sparingly, trying to create a path. The conductor watched them, his crimson eyes glowing, but he made no move to intercept them directly, content to let his minions do the work. It was as if he was testing them or guiding them through a deadly gauntlet. They reached the massive bulkhead. A smaller, man-sized access door was set into it, sealed with a heavy wheel mechanism similar to the one on the service tunnel hatch. "Get it open," Var yelled as a husk lunged at him. He sidestepped, firing his last 3 rounds into its glowing torso. The creature stumbled back, hissing, but didn't fall. He was out of ammunition. He threw the useless carbine at another approaching husk, then drew his combat knife, its blade gleaming faintly in the eerie light. Sorrenti was wrestling with the wheel, it stiff but moving. The husks were almost upon them. Var braced himself, knife held ready, preparing to sell his life dearly. The spectral Anya was weeping beside him. Patch's ghost gave him a grim thumbs up. Suddenly, a section of the catwalk above the conductor, already damaged from previous stresses, groaned and tore loose with a deafening shriek. It wasn't as large as the one in the Arctica's engine room, but it was heavy enough. It crashed down, not on the conductor himself, but in front of him, momentarily blocking his view and cutting off a group of advancing husks. "Now, Sorrenti," Var urged. With a final, desperate heave, Sorrenti spun the wheel. The heavy door clicked, then swung inward with a rush of stale, super-chilled air. Darkness lay beyond, the entrance to the beast. Var shoved Sorrenti through, then turned to face the oncoming husks, knife ready. One reached him, its glowing, skeletal fingers grasping for his throat. Var plunged his knife into its eye socket. The yellow-green light sputtered and died. The creature went limp. Before another could take its place, the conductor let out a piercing, metallic shriek, a command that was different from his usual groans. The remaining husks in the cargo hold, even those closest to Var, hesitated. They stopped their advance, their glowing heads turning towards their master. The conductor, stepping around the fallen catwalk debris, pointed his wrench towards the open doorway into the Lenin. He took one slow, deliberate step towards it, then another. He was coming himself. Var didn't wait. He scrambled back through the doorway, Sorrenti helping him pull the heavy door shut. They spun the wheel, sealing it, just as a tremendous blow struck it from the other side. The conductor. They were inside the Lenin. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the clicks of Sorrenti's Geiger counter, Var's had long since died, were a frantic, almost solid wall of sound. The radiation levels here were off the charts. The control room. It should be 2 decks above the primary reactor housing, Sorrenti said, her voice trembling, as she consulted Patch's tattered map by the light of her headlamp. "If we can find a shielded passage." The Lenin was a labyrinth of tight corridors and steep ladders, even more decayed and treacherous than the other ships. Strange, pulsating fungal growths, the heart molds Var had heard Patch mention clung to the bulkheads in places, emitting a faint, rhythmic thrumming and a dim, unhealthy light. Their spores filled the air, making Var's already tortured lungs burn. His hallucinations were reaching a fever pitch. The walls seemed to bleed, the floor to tilt. The spectral figures of Anya and Patch were almost solid now, walking beside them, offering contradictory advice, their voices lost in the cacophony of his own mind. He saw the conductor around every corner, his crimson eyes burning. "Var, are you with me?" Sorrenti's voice cut through the haze. She was shaking his good arm. "We're close. This ladder should take us to the observation level above the reactor chamber." He nodded dumbly, allowing her to guide him. They climbed. The heat was intense, even through their thermal gear. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the deck plates, a sound that seemed to resonate in Var's very bones. The heart of the cold fire. They emerged onto a narrow gallery, enclosed by thick, lead-lined glass portholes. Below them lay the primary reactor chamber of the Lenin. It was a scene from a nightmare. The massive, cylindrical reactor vessel was clearly breached, a jagged tear in its side glowing with an intense, hellish cherry-red light. Around it, the air shimmered with heat and visible radiation, and fused into the very structure of the reactor. Embedded in its glowing, molten core were bodies, dozens of them. Their forms were twisted, contorted, their flesh blackened and vitrified, yet they pulsed with that same internal, reanimating luminescence, their silent screams frozen on their faces. They were part of the core, part of the cold fire itself. "My God," Sorrenti breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. They fed it, they became it." The thrumming intensified. The entire chamber seemed to vibrate with an unseen power, and from the depths of the glowing, body-choked core, a new light began to emerge. Not red, not yellow-green, but a brilliant, piercing violet, the color of the most intense aurora. It coalesced, forming a vague, towering shape within the reactor's inferno. The Aurora Phantom, not a reflection in the sky but here manifest at the heart of the ship's dying, reanimating power. Its gaze, though featureless, seemed to fix on them, cold, ancient, and utterly alien. A tremendous crash echoed from the stairwell behind them. The conductor had arrived. He stood at the entrance to the gallery, his crimson eyes fixed not on Var or Sorrenti, but on the breached reactor core on the emerging Aurora Phantom. He raised his wrench, not in aggression, but almost in supplication. The heart of the cold fire was beating, and they were trapped between its monstrous priest and its even more terrifying god. Chapter 11: Sacrifice at the Core. The Aurora Phantom pulsed within the breached reactor core, its violet light washing over the gallery, imbuing the scene with a terrifying, ethereal glow. The conductor stood transfixed, his crimson eyes reflecting the phantom's light, his stance almost worshipful. The thrumming from the core intensified, a palpable wave of energy that vibrated through Var's teeth and bones, making his venom-induced hallucinations flare with renewed intensity. Sorrenti, however, seemed galvanized by the horrific sight. The control room access. It has to be on this level, she yelled over the deafening hum, her eyes scanning the gallery. If that thing, that phantom, is the source or the focal point, then disrupting the reactor might disrupt it. She spotted a heavy, shielded door at the far end of the gallery, a red light glowing fitfully above it. There, that must be it. The conductor, as if sensing her intent, slowly turned his head. His gaze, cold and malevolent, shifted from the phantom to Sorrenti. He let out a low, guttural growl and took a step towards them, his massive wrench held ready. "He's not going to let us reach it," Var said, his voice raspy. He pushed himself away from the railing, his combat knife his only weapon. The spectral figures of Anya and Patch flickered wildly around him, their silent screams and warnings lost in the overwhelming sensory assault. "We have to try, Var," Sorrenti insisted. She started towards the control room door, but the conductor moved with surprising speed, cutting her off. He swung the wrench in a wide, deadly arc. Sorrenti stumbled back, narrowly avoiding the blow as it slammed into the steel bulkhead with a deafening clang. Var charged, a desperate, almost suicidal move. He lunged at the conductor, aiming his knife at the Revenant's exposed neck joints. The conductor, with a contemptuous grunt, swatted him aside like an insect. Var crashed into the railing, pain exploding in his chest, his knife clattering away into the darkness below the gallery. He was disarmed, helpless. The conductor advanced on Sorrenti, who was backed against the thick, leaded glass viewport overlooking the reactor core. She held her own heavy wrench defensively, but it was a pitiful defense against the enraged Revenant engineer. "The core temperature is rising exponentially," she shrieked, her eyes darting between the conductor and her Geiger counter, which was emitting a single, continuous, high-pitched scream. "It's going critical. That phantom. It's drawing too much power." The Aurora phantom within the core seemed to expand, its violet light intensifying, throwing the gallery into stark relief. The bodies fused into the reactor pulsed with its energy, their silent screams seeming to grow louder. The conductor raised his wrench to deliver a killing blow to Sorrenti. In that moment, Var saw his chance. Not to fight, but to create a diversion. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the agony in his ribs, and lunged for the gallery railing again. This time he didn't stop. With a desperate yell, he threw himself over it. He fell not into the reactor core itself, but onto a narrow, precarious gantry that ran partway around it, a maintenance walkway he hadn't noticed before. He landed hard, the impact jarring every bone in his body, but he was alive, and he was closer to the breached, glowing heart of the reactor. The conductor, distracted by Var's sudden move, hesitated, his wrench frozen in mid-swing. Sorrenti seized the opportunity, ducking under his arm and scrambling towards the control room door. "Var, what are you doing?" she screamed, her face a mask of terror and disbelief. "Create an overload," Var yelled back, his voice hoarse. He was on his hands and knees on the gantry, the heat from the reactor core searing his exposed skin. The radiation was a physical force pressing in on him. His vision was almost entirely consumed by the swirling, violet light of the Aurora phantom. He saw a control panel on the gantry, its casing partially melted, wires sparking. It looked like a manual override for the coolant systems, or what was left of them, if he could disable what little cooling remained. The conductor, realizing Sorrenti was nearing the control room, let out a roar of fury. He turned from Var, lumbering back towards the gallery entrance to intercept her. Var reached the damaged control panel. His hands, clumsy from the cold, the burns, and the venom, fumbled with the fused switches. He found a heavy lever, encrusted with melted metal. He gripped it with both hands and pulled. With a screech of protesting metal, the lever moved. Deep within the reactor core, a new sound arose, a high-pitched, keening whine, as if the machine itself was screaming in agony. The cherry-red glow of the breach intensified, then shifted, becoming an almost unbearable, incandescent white. Var no! Sorrenti shrieked from the control room doorway. She had managed to wrench it open. The Aurora phantom within the core seemed to recoil, its violet form flickering, destabilizing. The conductor, halfway to Sorrenti, stopped, his crimson eyes wide with something that looked like fear. He turned back towards the reactor, letting out a sound that was almost a whimper. The entire reactor chamber began to shake violently. Alarms, long dead, suddenly blared with a cacophony of discordant noise. Red warning lights flashed erratically. "Melt down," Sorrenti screamed. "Var, get out of there." But Var knew he wasn't going anywhere. The heat was unbearable. His skin was blistering, his clothes smoldering. The spectral figures around him were burning away like ash in a furnace. He felt a strange sense of peace amidst the agony. He had done all he could. The conductor, abandoning Sorrenti, charged towards the gantry, towards Var, his wrench raised, his crimson eyes blazing with a desperate fury. He was trying to protect his god, his power source. Var looked up at the towering, destabilizing form of the Aurora phantom. For a moment, he thought he saw a face within its swirling energies, a face of ancient, cosmic indifference. Then, the phantom let out a silent, psychic scream that tore through Var's mind, and it began to implode, collapsing in on itself in a vortex of violent violet light. The conductor reached the edge of the gantry just as the reactor core erupted. A blinding flash of white light, a wave of unimaginable heat and force, consumed everything. Var felt a moment of transcendent, burning pain, and then nothing. Sorrenti, shielded by the heavy control room door which she'd managed to slam shut just in time, felt the deck plates heave, heard the deafening roar of the explosion. The lights in the control room flickered, then died, plunging her into darkness. The continuous scream of her Geiger counter was the only sound. When she dared to crack the door open a few minutes later, the gallery was a scene of utter devastation. The leaded glass viewports were shattered, the metal buckled and twisted. The reactor chamber below was a pit of roiling, incandescent slag, the intense heat still radiating upwards. Of Var there was no sign. Of the conductor, only a few scraps of blackened, metallic debris fused to the edge of the ruined gantry. The Aurora phantom was gone. The thrumming, the oppressive psychic presence that had permeated the linen, was also gone. The heart of the cold fire had been silenced. Sorrenti stumbled back into the control room, tears streaming down her face. Whether from grief, relief, or the sheer overwhelming horror, she couldn't tell. She had survived, but the cost had been immense. Kalen Var, the stoic, haunted security man, had sacrificed himself to stop the nightmare. His final act, a desperate gamble in the face of an ancient, unknowable power. Chapter 12: The Frozen Dawn. The silence that descended upon the Lenin after the reactor's cataclysmic overload was profound, a stark contrast to the preceding hours of terror and cacophony. It was a dead silence, the silence of a tomb finally at peace, yet heavy with the ghosts of what had transpired. Lyra Sorrenti sat huddled in the darkness of the Lenin's control room for what felt like an eternity, the only illumination the faint, dying glow from the ruined reactor chamber filtering through the shattered doorway. Her Geiger counter, its battery finally exhausted, had fallen silent, a small mercy. The immediate, pressing threat of the reanimated husks, the conductor, and the terrifying Aurora phantom was gone. Var's sacrifice had, it seemed, severed the unnatural connection that had animated the dead and empowered the malevolent intelligence within the ice. But the cost? Sorrenti eventually forced herself to move. The cold was seeping back in, a biting, relentless chill that Var's final, fiery act had only temporarily abated. She knew she couldn't stay here. The Lenin, now truly a radiological disaster zone, was no place for the living. Her headlamp was dead, but she found a heavy-duty, crank-powered flashlight in an emergency locker, its beam weak but serviceable. Armed with this and her wrench, she began the perilous journey back out of the dying flagship. The ship was different now. The oppressive psychic weight was lifted. The strange, pulsating heart molds were withered and gray, their luminescence extinguished. The corridors, though still treacherous and debris-strewn, felt empty. She encountered no husks, no glowing eyes in the darkness. Var's sacrifice had been total. The reanimating energy was gone, and the dead had returned to being just dead. The journey back through the Sevmorput was equally eerie. Patch's workshop was a wreck. The signs of his desperate last stand starkly evident. She found his body near the ruined doorway, the heavy crowbar still clutched in his hand. His one good eye was closed, his face frozen in a grimace of defiance. Sorrenti paused, a wave of sorrow washing over her for the cynical scavenger who had, in the end, given his life to help them. She gently closed his eye, a small, futile gesture of respect. She found no sign of Kim, Croft, or Dimitri at the helicopter site. The chopper itself was a mangled wreck, not just from the EMP-like effects of the Aurora, but from something else. Huge rents were torn in its fuselage, as if by giant claws. The cockpit was smashed, dark stains frozen on the seats. Sorrenti didn't need to look closer to know their fate. The tundra wolf scourge or other mutated horrors had likely found them. Alone, she was utterly, completely alone in the vast, frozen graveyard. The Aurora still danced in the sky, but it was different now. Weaker, its colors more subdued, lacking the violent, predatory intensity it had displayed before. It was just an Aurora now, beautiful and indifferent, its gaze no longer focused, no longer malevolent. The phantom was gone from it. Days turned into a blur of survival. Sorrenti, drawing on reserves of strength and resilience she hadn't known she possessed, scavenged what she could from Patch's supplies and the less irradiated sections of the Sevmorput. Food was scarce, warmth a constant battle. She spent her nights in Patch's relatively secure workshop, the heavy door barricaded, listening to the wind howl through the skeletal superstructures of the dead ships, the silence broken only by the groaning of the ice. She thought often of Var, of his quiet competence, his haunted eyes, his ultimate sacrifice. She meticulously documented everything she could remember, everything she had recorded on her now-dead scanner, writing in a waterproof notebook she'd found, her fingers often numb with cold. The scientific data was still important, yes, but it was Var's story, Patch's story, that she felt compelled to preserve, a testament to their courage in the face of unimaginable horror. 1 week after the reactor explosion, as a pale, frozen dawn broke over the icebreaker graveyard, she heard it, the distant, rhythmic beat of a helicopter. Scrambling onto the exposed deck of the Sevmorput, waving her arms frantically, she watched as a large, military-grade chopper approached, not the small Mi-8 that had brought them, but something far more substantial. It circled the graveyard once, then cautiously descended towards the same ice floe where their own helicopter had landed. The rescue team, clad in full hazmat gear, found her frostbitten, emaciated but alive. She was the sole survivor of the ill-fated expedition to the Arctic icebreaker graveyard. In the debriefings that followed in sterile, secure facilities far from the Arctic, Sorrenti told her story. She spoke of the reanimated dead, of the conductor, of the Aurora phantom, of Var's sacrifice. Some listened with skepticism, others with a dawning horror. Her data, her notes, were scrutinized, analyzed. The official report, when it was eventually released, would be heavily redacted, speaking only of a catastrophic radiological incident and severe environmental contamination. But Sorrenti knew the truth, and she knew that while Var's sacrifice had silenced the heart of the cold fire on the Lenin, the graveyard itself remained, a vast, frozen mausoleum saturated with radiation and the lingering echoes of ancient, unknowable powers. The Aurora would return in all its glory, and in the deep, frozen silence of the Arctic night, under its baleful gaze, what other horrors might one day awaken? She would dedicate her life to ensuring the world remembered and prepared. The icebreaker graveyard was a warning, a scar on the face of the planet, and sometimes in the quiet of her own nights when the wind howled outside her window, she would look towards the northern sky, half expecting to see that terrible, beautiful light and feel the chilling touch of the Aurora's gaze once more. The frozen dawn had come for her, but the long Arctic night, she knew, was never truly over. The end.